Welcome back to Preserving Our Past, Informing Our Future. I'm Sydney Stevenson, coming to you from the School of Occupational Therapy at Texas Women's University. And over this course of this series, Dr. Reed has guided us through the origins and evolution of occupational therapy, from its philosophical foundations to the tensions that have shaped its growth across time. Today, we begin to look ahead. We'll ask Dr. Reed to reflect on the current state of occupational therapy, what she sees in today's practice, research, and education, and what gives her hope as the profession continues to evolve. Through that lens, we can begin to see the future of occupational therapy not as a departure from its past, but a continuation of its ongoing process of adaptation. Dr. Reed has spent her career observing, shaping, and questioning that process. Dr. Reed, to start off this conversation, let's reflect. When you look at occupational therapy today, the practice settings, the research, the education, what makes you hopeful?
That OT is very resilient. We face challenges all the time. Various people have said, this is going to stop us. I remember when Medicare was first uh, passed. One of our prominent educators said, there's no way we can properly rehabilitate somebody who's had a stroke in less than 2 weeks. Well, we're obviously doing that, at least in the acute setting. She may be right that some aspects don't go away in 2 weeks, but we are managing to deal with the changing time dimensions of acute hospitalization. And that, I think, is indicative of our practice in education. Practice settings, for example, we very rarely treat anybody with tuberculosis now as a primary condition. We rarely treat anybody with polio, although having said that, Children's Hospital here in Texas does occasionally get somebody with primary polio from Mexico. But overall, we're mostly treating long-term effects of polio, and many of those people are no longer with us. But new conditions come on. Obviously, COVID is relatively new. Although it's not new, there's been a tremendous increase in interest in maternal health care in our literature. So I think that's an example of sort of moving on. So I guess in terms of what's hopeful, we will both continue to decrease emphasis in certain areas. For instance, where another area we've decreased considerably is chronic mental health institutionalization. Instead, we're dealing more and more with chronic mental health conditions in the community settings. And so I think we have to be aware that in practice settings, we will continue to find that some areas are no longer very high on our list because of the conditions that are actually external to us but impact us. And that the new practice settings or our ability to understand how we can be more effective with certain groups. I said maternal health care is certainly nothing new, but our understanding of what we can do to help, I think, has rapidly expanded. That impacts our education. I've already commented that the amount of time spent on arts and crafts in the programs has definitely decreased. The emphasis, okay. I think the emphasis on administration management has become much more important because increasingly we're seeing private practice or entrepreneurial activities increase. And the business administration supervision class is often one of the least favorite for students because they just want to know what they need to do to work with clients. I think we're going to have to figure out ways to challenge students to be more engaged in those classes because in many cases, in 2 or 3 years out of school, they're going to find themselves in managerial or business settings. Research has been a booming area and an area in which we constantly run into trouble. Um, uh, Funding for research has been an issue for forever. Figuring out how to do more research without having to have a lot of funding, I think is going to be an ongoing challenge. Right now, of course, the government is giving universities a very hard time about research funding, and that has some impact on us. We have figured out ways to create some of our own funding through the American Occupational Therapy Foundation. But In terms of our overall needs for research, that's frankly a drop in the proverbial ocean. I think with some of the technology we have today, we need to become better stewards of how to collect data on our own. Now, of course, the kind of research I do, funding is rarely available to start with. And so, yes, I ended up doing a lot of the data collection here and there among my activities, as a faculty member. And I have my own subscriptions to a number of the databases that I use regularly. And that's part of my professional activities. So I don't see that as a particular problem. So maybe our research classes need some revision in terms of the way they are taught, that there are a number of ways in which research can be helpful. Um, and they're not all experimental design or random control trial design. If you look, and maybe we don't spend enough time looking at the history of research in medical and health systems to understand that almost all of the breakthroughs in medical research have boiled down to one or two individuals being very persistent and very observant about their surroundings, and in some cases getting a lot of flack about their ideas. The one I can think of, the fellow who understood that what was called basically a stomach psychosomatic disorder turned out to be caused by the H. pylori virus. So it was not it's not a psychosomatic illness. It was a disease, and the disease had a treatment. And amazingly, many of the symptoms went away, including the ulcers. So we've had many, many examples of that. So I think maybe we're not doing as good a job as we could of helping students understand that, back to what makes a good OT, observation, mental flexibility, it need to be applied to research, that we need to come up with more creative ways in which to develop databases. We've talked over the years, for instance, about having facilities do more cooperation. I think we may need to continue to push that idea that more facilities need cooperative arrangements, and not just signed agreements with some federal program, but maybe more local or statewide, or a consortium of states doing more sharing of some of the issues. I think of one of the areas in which a consortium could be very useful in our area, because the southern states have a preponderance of Hispanic speaking people. More data sharing facilities and educational programs that have Hispanic speaking students and clients might be able to provide an avenue to further our research on how to work with specific minority groups that simply have traditionally their own set of problems and issues, which, while they may exist elsewhere, are very concentrated in them. So they may require slightly different approaches. In other words, the goal is the same. We want the people to be able to manage their health conditions, but their customs, that even though they may have lived in the States for a while, continue to predominate some of their lifestyle. Food, for example, is one of the ones I see in this area. It's Ramadan right now. We're getting a lot of information about traditions in Muslim and food habits. This is one of the things that stays with people for over a number of generations. We may have to become, for example, much more aware of dietary habits, and frankly, education, that dietary habits get much attention in the curriculum. And so that may be an area where we need to be more sensitive and more alert what we can do. Much of the information is out there, but it has not been collected and again observed and systematized into our educational programs or into our practice area and research. Mm. Anybody who says that OT is in trouble, it is not looking at the uh, not at the long view. Uh, we have overcome a number of things. Um, in the late, like 1998, when there was a tremendous cutback in the budget, we lost some positions. Some students had real trouble finding jobs, which was hard on them. But the long range projection turned out to provide additional opportunities for students and young therapists to develop positions, and the market continued. We're facing right now that the potential significant cutback in Medicare and Medicaid, which may give us a very hard time in the nursing home area, particularly. It will work its way out. Exactly how, my crystal ball is a bit opaque, but I can tell you from the historical trends of society that it will work its way out. This has always been a case of we figure out a way out, or more often society begins to figure out a way, and then we can take advantage of what society has proposed. So I I think all the major areas of OT have challenges. They will continue to have challenges, but I think we have pretty much established that we can work our way out. What I think is also interesting is that sort of inherent in our discussion here is relative to what's going on in the U.S. But if you look at the World Health Organization, it has not been very helpful to us anymore. We haven't really missed them. The Federation of Occupational Therapists has been really moving ahead to me that they're able to develop OT programs in countries that I frankly thought were not very high on our list. Because one of the themes that's inherent is we value all human beings, and we still have countries around the world where the value of some human beings is lesser or greater than others. And creating OT programs then in those countries is a challenge. Yet OTs are figuring out how to do it. So the World Federation, I think, is itself a very hopeful sign for OT, even though its impact on the practice in the US is probably not very great at this point. Maybe that's another issue we should be working on. Maybe we should be spending more time figuring out how those therapists are actually accomplishing developing OT programs in countries where the society would indicate that it's a challenge. Maybe we're missing some learning opportunities.
Hmm.
So I think we will continue. Will there be some bumps in the road? Yes. But I think we will ultimately figure out ways to fill in the patches or else create new roads.
I really like that. I think as a student who's about to graduate, it's nice hearing that. It is a hopeful message.
Yes, but the news can often make, when they kept talking about the cuts in, particularly in Medicaid, we realize that, yes, that can have a significant impact on physicians, particularly, I said, in long-term care facilities such as nursing homes. So some therapists may have to become a bit creative in terms of their opportunities. But for example, when we've had turn downs before is when we really began to push the school systems, which is now a significant area of employment. And there's more schools. We've done a better job in the public school system than we have in the private school system. So there's a direct issue. Private schools have traditionally been less willing to accept, shall we say, disadvantaged learners regardless of what caused their disadvantage. So they've been much less willing to see that OT or PT could be of any significant value. And since most private schools are funded by direct payment from the parents or guardians, they haven't seen, why would we want OT and PT? Our students are all fine. They're doing great. We need to be a little more creative in helping them understand that in some cases they probably are not, and or they could be doing better. In many cases, the parents of students in private schools want their children to excel, not just be average. Okay. So we may need to tailor the approach to OT towards the point of helping children to excel. Whereas much of our current approach in OT is to help, frankly, those children who are having difficulty meeting the basic requirements.
Mhm.
So we know how to do that. We know how to help people excel. Are we selling that? No. And again, is our educational program supporting that? Or are we continuing to concentrate on the children who are having difficulty meeting the basic standards? Who's teaching about preparing children with average intelligence to excel? I can think of one thing that's right off the top. Children in higher IQ and adults with higher IQs tend to have more problems with socialization. They see many of the people with whom they interact as having less intelligence, less ability to deal with society, and so they tend to shun them, which limits their ability to function in society at that level. So we know a lot about helping people socialize.
Yes.
Well, you can see my tendency to be always looking out beyond.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I get personally for doing that is they say, "Well, why are you so down on OT?" No, I'm not down on OT. I'm simply saying, yes, we're doing a good job. Yes, we could do a better job.
Mhm.
And are we providing the pathways in education, practice, and research to do that? It's very easy for an educational program, particularly, to get into a rut, maybe a big rut, because educational programs, face their internal problems of why that's happening with OT, but also educational programs all have to survive in institutional settings. Basics about understanding institutions is they don't like to change. And so the educational institutions have their own way of making it difficult to change the curriculum.
All right, Dr. Reed, I know that we have talked a little bit throughout this whole series about kind of areas that have education has changed an emphasis on. So, are there any aspects of early practice, the arts and crafts, emphasis on meaningful daily activity and therapeutic relationship that you believe should be reclaimed or re emphasized?
Because arts and crafts continues to have its place in OT. Part of it is, again, understanding the society. Much of the arts and crafts historically were vocations. They were how you earned your money or your place in society. Now, most arts and crafts are avocational, our choice, our leisure, our free time activities, although sometimes blend them a little with sort of a second job kind of situation. They earn us a little extra money. They're not the primary support for our budget. Nevertheless, they are there. Some of them have a very rich history. In our attempt to get people through acute care programs. They frequently simply don't manage to get far enough up the list to get any attention. But certainly, in sort of a little bit further in the recovery process, and certainly in the chronic management of the process, arts and crafts, I think, are still very much something that we should consider, and probably don't don't mention enough. We tend to deal with what we consider to be nuts and bolts of everyday living. Yet everyday living in today's society does not generally require 16 hours of keeping your thumb on the screw. There is some relaxation and downtime, and for some people, that's when they really end up in trouble. That is particularly people with mental health challenges. As long as they're at work or they're buying the groceries or paying their bills, they're okay for every hour of every day. And when they don't have something specific on the to-do list, they often run into trouble. Well, part of the way to fill out that to-do list is to look at the potential art and craft kinds of hobbies that they can turn to continue to be involved instead of having their mind reflect on things that basically they're not going to be able to change. Uh, so I think we have downplayed arts and crafts in most of the educational programs, saying, "Oh well, we used to do that. We don't do that anymore." Shortening our list of things that we can do to work with clients. If we're going to treat the whole person operates 24/7, 365, and an extra day every 4 years. We're supposed to be able to look at all of what they do, not just certain aspects. And I think our educational programs are maybe not doing a good job of reminding us that that is what we do best, is to not only look at the whole person, but to look at the whole day, the whole week, the whole month, the whole year. Dr. Meyer was very specific about us paying attention to time, that it isn't just specific occupations, it's occupations in a temporal context with an environmental influence. The way in which we break up our education into semesters or trimesters or quarters or whatever, and then we have to have specific labels for them because, again, that's what universities require, not what we require. And they don't like those general terms. The universities tend to like very specific terms. Means that we may be slicing and splicing OT knowledge into units that serve the university, but not the profession. I know too, having taught some of those media classes, students are coming to us with minimal hand skills. When I was an OT student, as I've commented, my mother had already taught me many of the arts and crafts that I was expected to learn in OT school. And if I hadn't been taught that specific one, my mother didn't know much about fly tying. One of our instructors was a fisherman and he thought we all should learn how to tie flies. So we did. I've never taught it in school. But nevertheless, the ability to use hands and to follow instructions on how to make things, I had. So I simply had to follow the instructions for the new activity. Students, for instance, who don't know the difference between a hammer and a screwdriver. Now, those are not that uncommon in our society. And even if you're not a carpenter, you can make some simple repairs in your house with a hammer and a screwdriver. So back to that sort of filling in behind routine that I think where educational programs are uh, having to do from the subjects that are traditionally considered academic. There's sort of some daily living things beyond being able to deal with a fork and a hairbrush. I think we have to re-examine the position of arts and crafts in our total curriculum. So I think traditionally the teaching arts and crafts was to teach us as therapists how to do things. And when that wasn't so important, the content began to drop out. Perhaps we need to again rephrase what we're doing, that it's not so important for us to know how to do arts and crafts as it is to understand that some of our clients need to find some art and craft type activities to do. We don't have to even know how to do those. We simply have to be able to help them identify that they might like to learn how to tie flies because they like to fish. And there's somebody out there who knows how to do that. Our job as therapists is to simply help them make the connections. So, yes, in that sense, I think we have that a significant knowledge area in our field sort of slip instead of reframing it. In other words, it's not so much the learning to do it as it is learning that it's out there. And for some of our clients, it may make a significant difference in their life. I remember one patient of mine in particular. We were it has to do with that pottery routine. He learned how to make. Slip pottery, and he actually came back for a follow up visit. Well, this was months after he had left, and he said, you know, that was the best thing I learned from being an inpatient at this facility. As he said, I needed something that helped structure my time, and making pottery did exactly that. Now, of course, we knew how to do that, but that's somebody who was able to identify um, that something he had learned in OT helped him organize his time and his activity because he had retired. And like so many people who were retired, he hadn't planned ahead. So he suddenly had all kinds of time on his hand and he was getting depressed. That's what brought him into the facility. Okay. Well, now he had something to structure his time that he liked. We didn't we didn't tell him you have to learn to like pottery. He identified it on his own and then was able to pursue it when he left the hospital and make it a significant part of his activity. So I'm a little disappointed in our approach currently to arts and crafts. Um, yeah, the therapeutic relationships. One of the things that is fallen away in our society is the ability to write letters.
Mhm.
And yet, when you look, for instance, at the history from World War II, what is the most significant thing that the historians keep pointing out? Yes, the battles are identified. But in terms of soldiers, it was writing back and forth from people here in the States to wherever the soldiers or sailors were located. Now, it's not just writing letters, it's also, r- writing, yeah, short stories, just creative writing, which is one of the ways in which we can make connections between people. OT used to also help with theater groups to put on plays. I had a good friend who were very active in the local theater, and she would bring the clients into the theater group, and most of them ended up helping, behind the scenes, with the creating the settings or controlling the flow of the actors on and off stage. But a few of them actually ended up with minor roles where they were actually on stage. There may be an OT somewhere who's doing that. If there is, I have not heard about it.
Me either.
So, so there's another connection. The local theater is still out there. OTs don't seem to be doing much in the way of participating. OTs used to put on puppet shows. I have not heard of anybody, it's in our literature.
Mhm.
So ways in which our therapeutic relations, the puppet shows was frankly partly to make the puppets, but also even more the message that the puppets were conveying, which was considered a way to talk to people in a way that was less confrontational. So, the puppets could get into all kinds of problems, even if you tried to role play with people. And some, like, for instance, domestic violence, you might not want the people to actually do. But the puppets can do all kinds of domestic violence and make the point about how dangerous that is and how much it hurts families. Yet, I don't see us doing that. So again, some of the things which we used to do, we don't seem to see as currently useful ideas. Yet, if they worked before, what is it that makes them not useful now? Mostly our inattention. The fact that we're not giving those ideas in our educational program. So there's just a number of things which, if you look in our literature historically, we have done painting. We had one of our faculty members here who was very much into having painting classes with our clients because, of course, painting, sketching, drawing was often a way to get clients to draw their problems or paint their problems. Now, technically, we have a field called art therapy, which concentrates on that, but that doesn't mean we can't, again, even if we don't do it ourselves, that we can not connect with others that are. And then for some of our clients, that might be another outlet that we used to facilitate and don't anymore. So those are a few of the things that I think are part of our heritage, some of which is well documented in our literature, that we're missing, ignoring, maybe not updating the approach to current situations.
Mhm. No, I think it's really interesting hearing some of the stories about, like, the what you were talking about with therapeutic relationship, because I remember reading about the puppets, and I was like, "This is so interesting. I've never heard this talked about in school." It was purely through my own research for
Mhm.
this project, and I just thought it was fascinating. It's really interesting how we've kind of turned away from some of that. But, Dr. Reed, moving on to our last question for today, do you have any concerns about the current direction of the profession? And are there any trends that kind of give you pause?
I think we've sort of covered that question. We need to continue to be observant and exercising our mental flexibility to help ourselves. Um, and there are all kinds of road bumps and barriers out there that we can either run into them and say, gee, I don't know what I'm going to do about that. Or we can say, yeah, I see that out there, but I'm not going to let it stop me. I will figure out a way around. And I'm using I in the most general sense of the profession, although obviously it applies to individuals, but that there will continue to be things that get in our way and it will be highly annoying. I think we have to learn and instill in our therapists that that's one of the strengths of our profession. We help our clients get around barriers and obstacles and bumps in the road. And again, perhaps we're not helping ourselves understand that if it works for our clients, perhaps what we need is a mirror. So we see that we can take advantage of the same approaches to enable us to deal with whatever is in front of us. Some trends are helpful, as said, our ability to expand our knowledge to areas in which we have not been traditionally involved. And I said maternal health happens to be the one that is most front and center right now. There are probably others. Well, and perhaps that entrepreneurial is another trend that we need to be aware of and facilitate. I guess another one I talked about was long COVID, in which our knowledge of treating tuberculosis is very helpful. It's all written down. You just have to identify it and read it. So we need to instill in our therapists that trends will happen. Governments will give us all kinds of static about this or that. Insurance companies get on our backs about not being specific enough in our progress notes. Those are all things we can overcome, and that trends are out there, and the profession needs to be willing to move ahead on those trends. Individual therapists may choose to take other directions, uh, but the profession itself and our educational programs need to be supportive of the idea that those trends are to be accepted. And perhaps there are some aspects of those trends in which we can help shape the direction and the implementation. Another area we've talked about for years is retirement. We're still not, in my mind, doing enough work in OT to help people, and that arts and crafts thing comes right into that. Um, to plan ahead and organize and create plan A, B, and C in some cases, of how to deal with the fact that if you retire uh, from full-time employment, maybe you should use that phase-out program, which many universities are doing and some of the other organizations are doing. But planning ahead is essential. Yeah. Another thing that happens, we're going to talk about therapeutic relations. We know that many people who retire end up becoming very isolated.
Mhm.
Why? Because all of their relationships were tied to their work, and they have not done the planning ahead or the examining what's available to them to fill in those relationships behind the ones they lost when they left their job.
So, for our last question today, Dr. Reed, how do you see technology reshaping the profession's philosophical foundations? Is that an opportunity, a risk, or both?
So technology has always shaped OT. Again, we tend to forget that technology was challenging our founders. It's just that that technology is sort of old hat to us at this point. Radio was the big thing in the early years. I used 1919 as sort of the crossover year in which radio became available more or less across the country. There were still, you know, pockets in the West. Another big technology was the typewriter. You know, when the profession started, typewriters were the newfangled gadget, and it began to appear in work settings. But it was not until after World War II, really, that a home typewriter was common. Knowing how to type, of course, directly facilitated your ability to move into using computers, seeing as how the keyboard is basically the same. But typing classes were a big factor when we started. I said retail stores, learning to be a salesperson was a big aspect back then. And that move that had been going on for a few years, the arts and crafts movement was actually an attempt to go backwards in time to counter the Industrial Revolution. But one of the things, for instance, that Susan Johnson ran into in her work is that more and more things were being manufactured and less things were being handmade, that the people she was working with were doing handmade stuff. She was having trouble getting people to buy it. Yeah, even people who had lots of money and a fair amount of spare change were not interested in buying many of the handmade things. So there's a more technology challenge. We may see less of that. When I was a student, we were learning to make uh, hand things, particularly splints, because they were not you couldn't buy them. The material back then was not at all useful. It was very brittle. It didn't last very long. And then we went through a series of plastics, which also baked like plastic is one of the ones I remember, which doesn't last. But we've had this technology challenge literally, from the beginning. Um, even where my grandparents lived in Kansas, it was 1955 before one of the stores had a television, and when it came on, it wasn't on all the time. It came on at 5 o'clock. You could see people gathering uptown, which is what they called the 2 or 3 block area that had stores in it, to watch the television in the storefront. Okay, so talking about television programs with your clients was a waste of time because they didn't have the television to see the program. So how would they know that you were talking about Howdy Doody, which was one of the first the children's programs? Okay. So if you lived in New York City, therapists could talk about Howdy Doody because many of their clients would have seen the program. And in Pretty Prairie, Kansas, and you were wasting your breath. So technology has both uh, within the field and within society uh, has changed. Mainframe computers in 1947, one of those you did not want in your house because you'd have been eating lunch on the keyboard because there wouldn't have been any room for anything else. The first home ones were actually kits. My father loved new technology, so he was putting together computers. And the only ones you could buy were kits. Then in 1981, IBM 8088 became available for home purchase, and it was a desktop size, but it was manageable in the home. Then the Apple IIe became available for purchase, sort of ready to go. When you bought your Apple IIe, it couldn't do much. You had to buy boards that you put in the slots in order to be able to get it to do anything. So if you wanted a word program or a database, or you wanted it to be able to keep track of time and dates, those all came on separate little boards which you had to put in slots. So technology has always been a challenge. I remember because computers were probably the biggest change when I was involved in teaching. Initially said I had the advantage. My father had various pieces of computers all over our living room, so I knew about computers. But the idea of how they could be used in the clinic was a new story. And again, first of all, I had to make sure the person knew how to deal with that keyboard. Had they ever used a typewriter? So, we're going to continue to have those technology challenges. Now that we have so many applications on the internet, for instance, you can do range of motion. You don't need a goniometer. The app that you can get on your phone will do the measurement for you. So we continue to evolve in technology. And so many of the apps that are available on the internet our clients can use. Telemedicine, for instance, is another big push forward in the technology. I didn't learn about telemedicine when I was in OT school because it did not exist. I always get a charge out of people when I tell them that I didn't learn about Medicare and Medicaid in school because they hadn't been passed yet when I graduated. So that's another challenge of technology, is knowing that the technologies are out there, being able to be able to understand how they function. So therapists do not have to become experts at using them. They need to know how they function, and then figuring out how to make them applicable to various client needs. Now, in the process, you may learn a lot about how to do it yourself. Being able to operate a computer now at home is relatively useful for other things in your life besides being an OT. Now, to go back and to the beginning, subscriptions to journals. Medical journals have been published since the 1860s, but their circulation was pretty much limited to facilities, institutions. About the time OT started, journals began to be available to individuals, so that so as you're acquainted, the journal ends up in your mailbox. So being able to read journals sort of when you figured out to put it on your schedule, as opposed to figuring out how you were going to put it into your work schedule, which often wasn't going to work out very well. That used to be the major complaints of librarians in hospitals, is that the staff had no time to come read them. They did better when they had their own subscriptions. So that's another thing that we've had to adjust to, is the greater availability of print materials. The same thing applied to newspapers. My dad and my uncle were newspaper boys in Kansas City, and that was not uncommon at the time, although obviously only in larger cities was that possible. So getting the newspaper landing on your front porch was also relatively novel when OT started. So, that's sort of my feelings about technology. Dealing with technology has always been with us, and our ability to make effective use of it has always been one of our challenges, and will probably continue to be.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reed, for sharing all of this information with us today. I think while there was a lot of things that you discussed that maybe the profession can grow from or they're not doing the best of right now, I think it was actually very encouraging to hear, and I think it was hopeful. But as we step back from this conversation, what becomes clear to me is that the future of occupational therapy is not a fixed destination. It's something the profession is actively shaping every day. The questions we've explored in this episode are not new. They echo the same tensions that have followed occupational therapy since its earliest days. But that is not a limitation, it's a strength. It reflects a profession that is willing to examine itself, to question its direction, and to remain grounded in its core values even as it evolves. If occupational therapy is, as we've discussed, an adaptive system, then its future will depend on how thoughtfully it responds to the challenges and opportunities ahead. Thank you for joining us for this conversation, and we will see you next time on Preserving Our Past, Informing Our Future.